A few weeks ago, I previewed 13 new monsters that were revealed in the Scions of Elemental Evil supplement that was kind of low-key released on D&D Beyond. Well, it turns out that there was another stealth adventure released around the same time called Uni and the Hunt for the Lost Horn, and that one contained 8 more monsters, most of which were new, but a couple we already saw in the 2024 Player's Handbook. Regardless, I love talking about monsters, so I thought it would be interesting to take another look at the changes and updates being made to monster design with the upcoming release of the Monster Manual, which is only a couple of months away at this point. Like I mentioned in my last video, this is a very important thing to discuss and evaluate, as despite having our hands on the new Player's Handbook for like 4 months now, we only still have half the picture here. We've all been making large assumptions about how we believe the game will play out, or have been discussing those evaluations and basing them on 2014 creatures, which, spoilers, many of which are significantly different than what we've seen so far with the 2024 monsters. So with that out of the way, let's get to the new stuff. We're going to go through all of the new monsters here alphabetically. Before that though, just a quick and massive shout out to all of my channel members, but especially my newest members, Zach and Landroid, but as always, Julian and Finiki in the Champion tier, and Jackal3 and Dill in the Hero tier. If you'd like to directly support me, click on the join button to see what you can get, but if not, that's always totally fine too. You just watching this video and sharing it goes a very long way, so thank you so much. First up is the Blink Dog. The most immediate change we see here is actually a decrease in hit points, something we've not seen a whole lot of with the new monsters. Most have had their HP increased by a good amount. In any case, we see here that its health has dropped from 22 to 16. The next change, while not massive, is worth mentioning. Its perception score has increased from +3 to +5. Now, what's interesting here is that its wisdom score has not changed. It's still sitting at +1. In both cases, it is proficient with perception, hence the additional +2, but now in 2024, we're seeing it sit at +5, which is odd. Closer inspection shows that they've removed the keen hearing and smell trait, which used to give the Blink Dog advantage on perception checks that relied on hearing or smell. We know that Wizards of the Coast tends to treat advantage on a roll as the equivalent of a +5, but that would mean that its passive perception should be 18 and not 15. My only guess here is that they split the difference. Instead of giving advantage on a specific type of perception check, they just improved all of its perception checks by an additional +2. I'd love to know what you think about this though in the comments. I'm in something of two minds about the change. Obviously, in this case, it's not that big of a deal, but it is indicative of the types of changes that they're making. Namely, ones that might sacrifice a little bit of flavor for the sake of simplicity and ease of running the creature. This certainly does speak to both of those things. I'm inclined to say that I like it, provided that the traits remain around and are remaining relevant. Now, there is a sample list of traits in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, so we know that they aren't going anywhere, but they do seem to be trimming them down quite significantly. The next major change comes with the Blink Dog's bite attack. The damage has changed from 1d6 +1 to 1d4 +3. What this functionally means is that the damage floor has been raised significantly, while not affecting the ceiling. The minimum damage on an attack is now 4 rather than 2, with the max still sitting at 7. This creates a much narrower range of damage, which also means that it's more reliable and consistent. Lastly, the Blink Dog's teleport feature has been moved from an action to a bonus action. There's no massive implication of this change, since they were always still able to attack as part of the teleport action anyway. So the only thing this really impacts here might be something that impacts the use of an action or bonus action, but not both. Next up is the Bugbear Warrior, which, despite having a different name, does seem to be the replacement for the old Bugbear, and it's seen quite a lot of changes here. One big but easy change to overlook here is the shift from the Bugbear being a humanoid to Fae. This is both simultaneously a big deal, but also not all that relevant. The important thing to remember and to be aware of is that spells that specifically target humanoids like Charm or Hold Person will no longer work on bugbears. The relevance of this is obviously largely dependent on how frequently your players cast those types of spells and cast them on bugbears. Though I don't have any particularly strong feelings either way about the bugbear specifically being classified as a fae, I do like that there are some shifts happening here, as small but potentially impactful changes like this can yield meaningful adjustments to how spells are picked and used. But we'll need to see the full picture before we can get an answer to this though. Next, there are some big changes to its defensive stats. AC has dropped from 16 to 14, but hit points have increased from 27 to 33. I think the likely reason for this change is due to the intended use for the creature, which we're going to get to in a minute. Oh, and it's no longer proficient in survival. Moving on to the trait section, we can see some big changes here. Both Brute and Surprise Attack are gone and have been replaced with one new trait, Abduct. I've spoken in another video about my theory as to why Brute was removed. Check out that video if you haven't already, but the Cole's notes are that I think the design team is aiming to remove traits that were simple passive effects that require no intention or activation, in an effort to streamline the stat block and ensure the creature is always functioning at its most effective. Anyway, Abduct says that the Bugbear's speed isn't halved when it moves creatures that are grappled by it. Side note, having speed and costing 1 extra foot of movement for every foot moved are not always the same thing, though they often are. I've also spoken about this in another video. Suffice it to say that I really wish they would just pick one for consistency, especially when they overlap like here. So the Abduct trait doesn't seem all that flashy or good on its own, but what it does do is something that we're seeing a lot more of with 2024 monster design, which is to allow creatures to fully execute combos with themselves and not have to rely on other external things. Let's look at the action section to explain what I'm talking about here. Firstly, the Bugbear now has an unarmed strike, which notably has a 10-foot reach, and provided the creature is medium or smaller, it's automatically grappled. Now we're starting to see the synergy with Abduct, and it relates to the point that I made earlier about its lower defenses. While it won't be happening every time, depending on the size and shape of the creature that it's grappling and how it's grappling it, it's not hard to imagine a world where the Bugbear is considered to have at least half cover, effectively putting its armor class back up to 16. So I assume that given how easy grapples now are to execute with it, the design team didn't want to risk the Bugbear having an AC as high as 18, but that's just a theory. Next is the Light Hammer attack, which again notably has advantage if used against the creature that it is grappling, so there's a whole lot of synergy here. Also, the Light Hammer deals 3d4 damage rather than the 1d8 that a typical Light Hammer would do. I again think this goes back to the Brute point from before. What's cool though is that it does also apply to the ranged attack option too, whereas it did not for throwing the Javelin back in 2014. The clear and coolest use case for the Bugbear now is some kind of abductor or kidnapper. It grabs someone and holds them in front of their body while walking backwards and hucking some light hammers at the targets. Granted, it does only have 3 of them, but in any case, I think this is such a cool and thematic redesign of the creature, and I have to say that I kind of like it. Moving on to the next creature, we have the Bullywug Warrior, which again seems to be the replacement for the standard Bullywug from 2014. The Bullywug Warrior has also got the same treatment as the Bugbear, now being listed as a Fae, but we already talked about that, so we're not going to do it again. Neither its AC or hit points have been changed. The only other noteworthy change in this whole portion is that its dexterity score has been bumped from 12 to 14, which both increases its stealth score from +3 to +4, and also improves its initiative from +1 to +2. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it's not irrelevant either. It does also speak common now too. The trait section has been cut down a bit. Amphibious and Speak with Frogs and Toads are both there and remain the same. However, Swamp Camouflage and Standing Leap, while no longer there, have kind of just been repackaged. Instead of having advantage on stealth checks in swampy terrain, it just got a slight boost to its stealth score, now seeing it +4 like we mentioned earlier. This is seeming to be a common trend to, instead of giving very niche abilities that sometimes work when you remember them, they just get a smaller bonus that applies all the time. As for Standing Leap, jumping in 2024 seems to be being treated very differently than it was in 2014, with so many effects generally letting you greatly exceed your total movement with a jump, something that did not used to be the case. The Standing Leap trait has effectively moved into the Leap bonus action, which now lets the Bullywug jump 30 feet by only spending 10 feet of movement, which honestly feels pretty on brand for a frog. This can essentially give it 40 feet of overland travel, so that's pretty cool. Going back to its actions, these options have also been cut down. Multi-attack is gone, as is the spear attack. Instead, it's been replaced by a single insectile rapier. So the downside is that the attack can no longer be divided or split up, but the upside is that an individual attack is slightly more likely to hit with a +4 rather than a +3 thanks to the dexterity bump that we saw earlier. And the hit deals the same average damage as both attacks used to, assuming you use the spear two-handed. So the individual hit is much more powerful, and like I mentioned in my previous monster video, includes elemental damage. I love that they're putting more examples of elemental damage, and especially in lower CR creatures, and I'm hoping it will make them much more relevant. And on the flip side, make the players feel even better about choosing or having access to specific resistances. Next up is the Mage, and this is probably the most significant change of all, and I think there might be a little bit of dislike for this one, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts, so let me know. Firstly, we see that it can now be medium or small, okay? Anyway, we also see that it has an armor class sitting at 15 now, rather than 12 or 15 with Mage armor like it used to say. It is worth noting that it still has Mage armor active. This is shown in the spell section, but it just makes it easier for new DMs because, let's be honest, they always had it active anyway, and the spell is listed as at will. The next change is a massive hit point bump, going from 40 to 81. That's more than double. That's a lot. Looking at the actions section, we now see that the old dagger attack is gone and it's been replaced with Arcane Burst, which is a melee or ranged attack with a range of 5 feet or up to 120 feet. The reason this is relevant for those that don't already know is that being melee or ranged and having that 5-foot range means that there is no disadvantage when making the attack within 5 feet of a hostile creature, which could be a very big deal. Arcane Burst hits at a +6, which is the same as the old Mage, and it deals 3d10 force damage, so it's scaled like an 11th level Firebolt. But this is where things get a bit messy and complicated, so let's take a look at the 2024 Mage spell list to get a little bit more context. Oh, and didn't forget the most important part though, you get to make 3 of these attacks. That's a lot of damage. At first glance, the new Mage's spell list looks significantly smaller than its 2014 counterpart, and that's mostly because it is. But there is at least kind of a reason for it, and some of it does also come down to just repackaging. Firstly, we see its at-will spells are Detect Magic, Light, Mage Armor, Mage Hand, and Prestidigitation. 2 of those are spells that would have previously consumed spell slots, but don't anymore. Next, at twice per day each, we get Fireball, Fly, and Suggestion. Yeah, before you had 3 third level slots, so you could technically cast Fireball 3 times, but you probably weren't gonna do that anyway. This can functionally be seen as 5 third level slots if we include the extra use of Counterspell in the reaction section, but we'll get there shortly. And then, topping it off, we still get Cone of Cold once per day. So there are some notable exclusions here. Firebolt, Magic Missile, and Misty Step jump to mind, but obviously we also don't see Greater Invisibility or Ice Storm either. In regard to Firebolt and Magic Missile, I think they decided to functionally replace them with Arcane Burst. Don't come at me, this is just speculation. In some ways, it's better than both of them. Firebolt would have dealt 2d10 damage, whereas Arcane Burst deals 3d10, up to 3 times, and they've got the same range, but Firebolt was also only a ranged spell attack, so it would have suffered disadvantage on the attack roll if within 5 feet of a hostile creature. Even if that might be niche, it's still worth mentioning. And in 2014, Fire was a much less reliable source of damage than Force, but this change would also mean that you couldn't use it to trigger the failed regeneration on a troll. So you win some, you lose some. As for Magic Missile, the obvious thing is that Arcane Burst doesn't always hit like Magic Missile does, but as a trade-off for that, it doesn't cost a spell slot and deals more damage on average, and you can use it 3 times. I really think that their intent here was to remove the damage dealing cantrips and replace them with Arcane Burst. As for Misty Step being gone, well, Flying now isn't competing with your other third level slots like Counterspell and Fireball, so I think that it makes it potentially easier to cast and does grant a ton of mobility as well. Additionally, the plethora of extra hit points that it got does help to some degree compensate for some lack of mobility here. I think this is their logic, but I still miss Misty Step. It's one of my favorite spells in the game. Losing Greater Invisibility does kinda hurt and would have been nice to keep, but if I had to guess, I would think that it wasn't all that likely to have been cast anyway, at least while in combat. But obviously in narrative situations with a friendly mage, it certainly could have. Lastly, you'll also notice a new reaction section, which now includes both Counterspell and Shield. I like that they've included these here for a few reasons. Firstly, it just makes it easier to look at the block and immediately get a better grasp of your action economy with the creature, especially for a new DM. But also, in contrast to 2014, these spells no longer compete with your other spell slot resource. Casting Counterspell no longer means 1 less use of Fireball, and casting Shield no longer means 1 less use of Magic Missile. It's a big deal. And unlike players who are now limited by the new 1 spell with a spell slot per turn rule, these are not spell slots. A mage can absolutely use both Cone of Cold and Counterspell on the same turn. Every time I say that in videos, at least a few people comment saying that I'm wrong, And while we still don't have official confirmation, I think this stat block pretty heavily alludes to this being the case. The redesign of the Mage is significant, and honestly, I could probably have dedicated an entire video just to it, but I didn't, so let's move on. I think I am a fan of this redesign, and I think it makes it much more potent and relevant in both the straight up fight and when mixed in with other creatures, and it certainly sells the power of casters in this world. Next up is the Sprite, and I should note that this creature, along with the Warhorse, were actually included in the new player's handbook, but I still think they're worth quickly going over. Firstly, again, it got a massive hit point bump from 2 to 10, that's 5 times. Then in the action section, we also see some big changes. The longsword has been changed to the needle sword, which now deals 1d4 plus 4 piercing damage rather than the flat 1 slashing damage, and it hits at a plus 6 rather than a plus 2, so that's a pretty crazy jump. Next, the short bow has been swapped for the enchanting bow, which still deals 1 piercing damage on a hit, but the additional effect has changed from becoming poisoned or unconscious depending on how badly the target fails their constitution save, to just being an immediate charm effect that lasts until the start of the Sprite's next turn. I'll say from my perspective, the charm effect here feels decidedly more Fey-like. It also guarantees the target is unable to attack the Sprite rather than just having disadvantage on that attack. Granted, that disadvantage would apply to any target. The advantage when communicating socially can also make for some interesting interactions if the target didn't see where the arrow came from. I'm thinking like Cupid over here. This sounds really fun and flavorful, and I like it a lot. Hard Sight has been slightly changed to keep the entire effect behind a charisma saving throw rather than just the alignment, which I guess, I'm not sure it really needed the save at all, but I don't think it's that big of a deal either way. Lastly, invisibility is almost exactly the same, except that they specifically state that it is casting invisibility, the spell, so it could potentially be countered. Otherwise, they function the same. Overall, I think the changes to the Sprite are meaningful and make for a much more fun creature to use in Fey adventures. I'm a fan. Next is the Worg, which has also seen the same creature type treatment. It's now listed as a Fey rather than a monstrosity. Other than that, we don't see any other changes until the trait section, which has been removed, and Keen Hearing and Smell is no longer in the block at all. The odd thing here is the notes that I was making earlier about how they translated these traits into subtle skill bonuses doesn't seem to have applied here. The Worg had a +4 perception in 2014, and it still does now in 2024. We can possibly chalk this up to the fact that they do say that these are not the final versions, so maybe it'll end up getting an extra +1 or something? I'm not sure, or maybe it's just got expertise, I don't know. Finally, the Bite attack has had its damage reduced slightly, but the secondary effect has been redesigned. It now deals 1d8 +3 rather than 2d6 +3. Additionally, it now automatically guarantees the next attack made against the target before the Worg's next turn is made at advantage. Previously, it had the chance to knock the target prone, which was conditional on a failed DC 13 saving throw. Prone is obviously a good condition in certain circumstances. One of the best things about it is that it gave melee attackers advantage on attacks, but the downside of that is that it gave ranged attackers disadvantage. This now circumvents all that and gives all attackers, melee or otherwise, advantage on their next attack roll, which can be a very big deal. There is something flavorful lost here in my mind. The imagery of a Worg biting and tearing down a creature is pretty visceral, but I suppose the intent here is that the target might be just so distracted by the attack itself. Next is the Warhorse, which again was published in the 2024 Player's Handbook, but we'll look at it since it should be pretty quick. The only change here is what used to be in the trait section has been merged into the Hooves attack action, and the effect has been streamlined. The old Trampling Charge trait required the Warhorse to charge 20 feet toward a target, successfully hit it with its Hooves attack, then require the target to fail a DC 14 strength saving throw. If those things happened, the target would fall prone, and the Warhorse could make a bonus action attack at advantage, obviously since the target is now prone. Now, the Hooves action combines all of it into one and removes the save. It still needs to move at least 20 feet straight toward the target before the hit, but if it does hit, the target just immediately takes an additional 2d4 damage and is under the effect of the prone condition. So yes, the average damage is lower across both hits, but now, instead of needing 2 successful hits and a failed saving throw, you just need 1 hit. I honestly like changes like this. They make creatures so much easier to use and allows them to reliably activate their abilities, which their challenge rating is accounting for anyway. So it's great that they're actually getting to do it, This is what's contributing to creatures feeling like they're actually hitting at their CR now. Finally, we have the Bullywug Bog Sage, which doesn't actually have a comparable, as there was no CR4 Bullywug in 2014, so this is a new range of challenge for this type of creature, which is another thing that we are promised to see more of, which is very cool. There isn't a whole lot to say about it that we haven't covered with other creatures already though. I am particularly liking that spellcasters are getting reliable and powerful multi-attack options that are not spells. The Bog Sage can make 2 attacks with its Putrid Staff, dealing 1d8 plus 3 bludgeoning, and 3d6 poison damage on a successful hit. And again, they can do it twice. Its spell list is flavorful and not too bad either. Getting an upcasted version of Ray of Sickness isn't too shabby. 3d8 poison damage and an automatic poison condition can be pretty solid, especially since it's at will. Things like this help the Bullywug contribute really well to a larger fight where they're a backline support. Vitriolic Sphere is also a nice inclusion and isn't a spell that we hear too much about. And I also like that they gave it at least one area of effect damage spell as well. Oh, and there actually is one more creature, a 9th one, but we don't have a stat block for it yet. I was at PAX Unplugged this weekend and went to see Acquisitions Incorporated live, and Jeremy Crawford was using the new Shambling Mound. He mentioned specifically that it was the new version of it. So again, while I don't have a stat block, I can confirm now that it has 3 attacks with its multi-attack rather than 2, and it now deals lightning damage. I'm also quite confident that the attack range is now larger than 5 feet, and it no longer needs all hits to be successful before grappling, and it seems like it can still engulf on top of that. Some of the details here are admittedly fuzzy, but it seems like an already quite strong creature is getting a solid buff as well. So that's it, that's a look at 9 new creatures in the new Monster Manual. Let me know your thoughts on them in the comments. I'm really looking forward to seeing what everyone has to say about them. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.